Mercantilism, triangular trade, and the navigation acts.
I'm Sienna.
And I'm Gabbi.
In this video, we are going to go over the definition and impact of mercantilism, triangular trade, what it was and how it affected different countries, and the navigation acts, what they were and how they impacted the colonies.
Definitions. Mercantilism. So, mercantilism was an economic system made to increase a nation's wealth by governmental regulation of all the nation's commercial interests. The other vital term was triangular trade. This emerged as a result of mercantilism. So, in this international system, the Americans would send raw goods to Europe and Africa, and then Europe supplied Africa and America with the finished goods. And the third section of it was that Africa captured and transported slaves to the Americas, where they could use those slaves to make the raw goods to send back.
Mercantilism and triangular trade. Trade and mercantilism in the Americas has been the base of our economy and a large piece of our culture since the Columbian Exchange.
It has created countless opportunities and issues, and to quote Henry Gates, the sad truth is that without complex business partnerships between African elites and European traders, the slave trade to the New World would have been impossible. And we can see over here a slave trade advertisement for slaves to be sold in the colonies.
When the colonists came to the Americas looking for a new life and religious freedom, those people's home countries' government saw the colonization as an opportunity to gain capital funds and get rich.
The way these countries were able to trade crops, slaves, and other items was through transatlantic trade. This trade, which forms a triangle shape, connected Africa, Europe, and East America. Looking at this map on the screen, we can see an example of transatlantic trade. So one example of this might be a ship leaving Massachusetts carrying rum across the Atlantic Ocean to Africa, where the rum would be traded for Africans. Then the ship would return across the Atlantic to the West Indies, where the slaves who survived the Middle Passage would be traded for sugarcane and left there to continue to farm sugarcane on plantations. Then the ship might sail again up the coast of America back to New England, where the sugar would be made into rum. So this reoccurring trade made the countries who were exporting these items on these ships very, very wealthy.
During the 17th century, the largest first export was, of course, slaves. The Royal African Company was the supplier for quite some time. However, eventually the demand grew to be too much and New England merchants began to take over the business.
This trade was a result of most European countries during the 16th century adopting mercantilism as their economic system. This meant that countries were in a rapid race to export more than they were importing.
The colonies at this time' only purpose was to provide raw materials for the mother country to export. The Spanish and French rulers had been using the colonies for this purpose from the beginning of colonization. Charles II, King of England, in 1651 began to use the colonies more specifically for this purpose, after the English Civil War. He began to set tariffs to avoid supporting other countries' mercantilism systems.
So next let's look at the navigation acts and kind of what they were. Between 1650 and 1673, England's government implemented a mercantilist policy with a series of navigation acts. These acts established 3 rules for colonial trade. Trade to and from the colonies could only be transported by English or colonial-built ships. And in addition to that, these ships could only be operated by English or colonial crews. 2. All goods, excluding perishables, had to be passed through English ports. 3. Specific or enumerated goods from the colonies could only be exported to England. An example crop would be tobacco in the early years. However, eventually it expanded to be a highly dependent on crop. So we can kind of see that all of the navigation acts were centered around these 3 ideas.
When we look at the impact of navigation acts on the colonies, we can see it had mixed effects. However, the triangular slave trade between the colonies and Africa was unaffected by these regulations.
It provided aid in New England for shipbuilding, provided Chesapeake tobacco a monopoly in England, and provided protection of the colonies from the French and Spanish. But it also slowed down the growth of the colonies. It severely limited the development of the economy. Since colonists were restricted from manufacturing their own goods, they had to pay high prices to England, fueling their wealth. And since Chesapeake farmers could only sell their crops to England, they had to sell for very low prices. An example of this was in the 1660s, when low tobacco prices that resulted from high productions brought very difficult times to the colonies.
Under the table, there was smuggling, such as colonists trading with the local Indians. They traded furs, foods, and other goods. The trade of these goods led to cultural exchange as well. Examples of this include Indians becoming Christian and also colonial men marrying Indian women.
In total, there were main acts. Some important ones include Act of 1651, which cut off trade with the Dutch; Act of 1663, which then required all important, besides perishables, to pass through ports of England; and the Molasses Act of 1733, which was an attempt to stop trade with New England and the West Indies. However, there were a lot more, such as the Act of 1732, the Iron Act of 1750, and the Act of 1651.
Enforcement of the acts. The theory of mercantilism called for strict enforcement of the rules and trade regulations. However, England was very lax when it came to enforcing rules. This became known as salutary neglect. Other factors caused problems in enforcement. These included the ocean between the two worlds, the English Civil War, and corrupt colonial agents who were often bribed to overlook the rules.
So now let's kind of just go over everything that we learned and summarize what you'll need to know from this video. So mercantilism is an economic system where trade and colonies were wealth accumulating to make their home country rich, and that strictly or statutorily regulated trade will make the mother country very wealthy. This was the only reason that the mother country thought for the colonies to exist.
Triangular trade is the idea of trade between Africa, Europe, and America to create a triangle. This trade was the result of mercantilism and directly fueled the slave trade alongside other goods like rum and sugar.
And then lastly, the Navigation Acts. These acts restricted trade of the colonies. This severely slowed the economic growth and affected the production of income, especially after so many years of statutory neglect by England.